Thank you, Pedro, for joining us.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
This is an unprecedented time for Canadians with a big impact in our economy.
Yeah, well, definitely, this is going to be substantial. We are expecting, of course, that these imposed and self-imposed and imposed measures that we are putting in place to contain the effects of the virus are obviously having a detrimental and a huge impact on Canada's economy. We certainly saw early on the impacts from, for example, tourism from China, et cetera. But it's these measures that we've put in place now over the last 2 weeks that are really having an impact of what we would call I guess a shutdown in demand from consumers essentially being at home, not going to purchase in terms of retail, in terms of all sorts of activity. So this is really a big shock to the Canadian economy. We're going to see a number of industries shut down. And the big question mark for us is how long all of this will last. How long until we see these measures eased? Right now, we're probably not expecting to see much of that happening until perhaps the third quarter and second half of the year.
This is a unique event in our history. How different this is from SARS in 2003?
Well, I think it's very different. In fact, I mean, just the scale of the contagion on a global basis. So this, I guess the first thing that this reminds me of is a little bit like what happened in 2008, 2009, where we had really a synchronized global recession. And this is what's happening now with what we're seeing here in Canada in terms of this, again, these imposed measures that are shutting down many industries. We're seeing the same thing across pretty much the rest of the world. So this is one of the implications. It's a global slowdown. It's having an impact on certain segments of the economy that are very important for Canada, like the energy sector. We've seen, for example, just yesterday, oil prices hitting record lows because of this decline in global demand. Moreover, I think it's very different in SARS just in terms of the measures that were taken. So SARS was much less contagious than this COVID-19 is. And so the measures that are put in place are very, very much more drastic, I guess. All of these social isolation measures that are having that double impact on the economy that we just discussed.
What will be the effect of COVID-19 in our economy? You're talking about that accumulation, business survival and recovery, also employment, immigration, and of course housing.
Well, yeah, no, I mean, I think it's going to have impacts across the board on short term in terms of the impacts on job losses, for example. We're going to start to see those in the numbers in March. Obviously, we've already seen huge take up in terms of some of the government programs that have been put in place. We saw over 1 million claims for employment insurance just in a few weeks. So we're seeing or trying to get an understanding of the extent of these impacts just on labor markets. But of course, we're seeing a lot of fiscal measures put in place to try and essentially get us through this very rough patch, ensure that Canadian households have incomes to support themselves through this period, and also all sorts of measures that we're seeing in terms of monetary policy, in terms of credit and lending, to make sure that businesses as well get through it. So the short-term impacts are going to be drastic, but I think your question is really valid in the sense of where does this leave us longer term? And I think we do expect that once this is temporary, once we get through it, we'll see the economy rebound. We'll see consumers go back to shop, and things getting a little bit more back to normal. But it is going to leave us with bigger debt load, especially when we think about the government finances. We keep hearing that the federal government is in pretty good shape, but a lot of the provincial governments are putting a lot of measures in place, and they are going to eventually have to tighten their belt. We've seen very low interest rates. This will support Canadian households that are very indebted, as we know. But again, as we look forward, we're going to get into more debt this year because of the essentially declines in revenues. Lower interest rates will motivate us to borrow. And as we look longer term, we're going to be in a situation where household debt is probably cranked up a notch or two. And how are we going to fare once the economy does go back to normal, and we do see interest rates, I assume, going back to more normal levels as well. So those are just two small things that we need to think about. I think corporations as well will probably take on more debt and have to deal with those consequences.
Also, Conference Board of Canada launched early this week a release study analysis about social distancing implications. So what implications will we see?
Well, essentially, we're looking at the impact on the economy short term from these distancing measures that, as we discussed, were put in are essentially being put in place by federal and provincial levels of government, but also self-imposed. And I think, again, this is going to have a very deep impact on the economy short term. We're still in the first quarter. Today would be the last day, but as we get into the next quarter, we think the majority of the hit, of course, will be in that second quarter, where we are shutting in a lot of industry for, when we think about accommodation and food service industries, when we think about anything to do with transportation, when we think about some of the manufacturing sectors, everything non-essential has really been shut in. And this is something like we've never seen in the economy. It will lead to drastic declines in economic output, I guess, if we can phrase it that way. The question is, how long does it last? And this is what the big question mark is. So we did look at that. We do feel it's going to be a very big impact in the quarter. It will have an implication, essentially putting the economy in recession in 2020. But we are hopeful that if we are successful in containing the virus within a few weeks, months, that by the time we get into the second half of the year, we'll start to grow out of this. And again, assuming that the measures that we put in place, fiscal and monetary policy measures, do hold back the number of bankruptcies, both corporate and households, that the financial services sector will stay intact and that we'll be ready to grow once this is behind us. So I think there is light in the sense that the economy will rebound. The question is, how long will this last in the interim?
So what other measures do we need?
Well, I think the government has really focused on important measures. Essentially, I think the first measures that we put out there were measures to ensure that we had, adequate funding for healthcare services and to ramp up essentially the needs of a population that is being infected and suffering the consequences of this virus, of this pandemic. So those measures, those first fiscal measures have been really focused on the healthcare sector. What we've seen since then is a ramping up of more and more measures to, I think, do two things. One is to support both businesses and households through this patch where we're going to see very deep losses in revenues and income, but also I think, and perhaps even more importantly, to ensure that that there's confidence that we can get through this. In other words, to make sure that we don't have knock-on effects, these of essentially weaker or weakened consumer confidence or weakened business confidence that leads into these kinds of knock-on implications for the economy. So the very real, putting money back into the hands of households and businesses to support them through the loss in revenue, but also these kinds of intangibles, which are the loss of confidence, and hopefully supporting and making statements that suggest that, we are going to support the economy at all costs. We'll get through this, and helping us get by without further consequences.
Thank you, Pedro, for sharing with us your perspective. It was a pleasure.
No, thank you for having me.